Hello students, welcome to Blockchain 532, lab number 1. In this very first lab, I'm going to demonstrate, and you'll follow along, on setting up your development environment. At the end of this lab, you'll basically have your own development environment set up. I'll be showing you how to do it on a Windows machine, a Windows 10 box. If you have Mac OS or Linux, you can skip forward beyond the Windows components, and I'll point out where those are. So I'm actually in the textbook here, and I see that in Chapter 3 there's a whole section on setting up the development network, or environment rather. And our environment's going to look something like this. We have a lot of peers that are going to be running, and each one of these peers will be virtual machines, or actually Docker containers. So there's a lot of work to be done before we get down to the installing the prerequisites. This is the place you would start if you have a Mac OS or a Linux operating system computer. If you're running Windows, we'll start somewhere else. Alright, look at section 1 in your lab. The first thing is initial setup for Windows computers. This is again from chapter 3. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to install VirtualBox. VirtualBox is a virtualization product that allows us to run multiple virtual machines on one computer. After that, we're going to install Vagrant, which is a VirtualBox management tool. Makes it easy to fire up and manage virtual machines. And then lastly, once we have these virtual machines running, we need to be able to connect to them to get to a Linux shell prompt basically. And we're going to use PuTTY. You can really use any terminal emulator you want, but we'll use PuTTY. So those are the three pieces. So the first thing is I'm going to navigate to virtualbox.org, and I'm just going to click download VirtualBox. Alright, I want to download VirtualBox for a Windows host, so click on this, save it. And once that finishes, let's just launch it. There we go, VirtualBox. Click on it to open the file. So let me bring this over. I already have VirtualBox installed, so you would just click Next, and the option you would get would be to install. So you would just basically accept all the defaults, work all the way through, and install VirtualBox. Once you have it installed, if you launch VirtualBox, you'll see something like this for the interface. Now I already have a couple virtual machines defined. Yours will look a little different, but let's just leave this alone and we'll come back in a moment. And by the way, notice I have 2 virtual machines installed. Alright, so after installing VirtualBox, then you want to go and install Vagrant. With Vagrant, you go to vagrantup.com, and that's again in step 1.2. Click on the download link for the latest version. And we want to download Vagrant for Windows. I'm running Windows 64-bit, so I'm going to click on 64-bit, save the file. And then I want to open the file. Vagrant gives me the version number, and it's an MSI file. So just click on it. Are you sure you want to do this? Yes, I trust Vagrant. So I click OK. It brings me up to the Vagrant setup wizard. It is computing space requirements to make sure that my computer is going to meet the requirements. And now it's ready for me to click Next and install Vagrant. So I click Next, accept the term license agreement. I'm just going to use the default location. You can change that if you want to, and install. Notice it does require permission. And I give it permission, and there we go. And while Vagrant is installing, basically we're going to use Vagrant to manage the virtual machines. Even though VirtualBox gives us the ability to create and manage individual ones, this gives us the ability to kind of pull it all together into one central interface. You'll see it's a little bit easier with just 1 or 2 commands. We can bring them up, bring them down, things like that. Vagrant has several pieces in the install process, and it also is updating component registration, so it may take a few minutes on your computer. I'm clearly speeding things up a little bit so you're not having to watch the entire installation on my side. And now Vagrant is completed, or the installation is completed, so click Finish and we're done. And notice it'll say you have to restart your system for the configuration changes made to take effect. You should say yes. I'm going to say no because I'm going to take a break and reboot in a moment. But you should absolutely reboot right then. I'm going to go ahead and continue to the next piece of the puzzle, and that is installing PuTTY. PuTTY, and the link is in your lab guide. Follow that link and you'll get to this page, and you can simply download the latest version. Click on download it here, and you kind of have to look around just a tad, but again, I'm going to download the 64-bit MSI installer for Microsoft Windows. Save file, and once that installs, once that downloads, then I would simply open that file. Yes, I know when I want to install this, and here's the installation wizard. Now, I've already installed PuTTY on this machine, so I'm not going to install it again. But in this case, that's exactly what we'd want to do. Just go ahead and install it, and we're ready to go. All right, so now you should have the three pieces installed. You should have VirtualBox, Vagrant, and PuTTY. I'm going to stop here for a minute, reboot my machine, and come back, and then we'll start setting up our Vagrant project. All right, once you come back after rebooting, I've already installed all the basic pieces. I've installed VirtualBox, Vagrant, and PuTTY, and I'm ready to move to the next step, which is to set up my Vagrant project. A Vagrant project is basically the place, it's really a subdirectory with a collection of files that we use to manage the environment, bringing it up, bringing it down, things like that. All right, so I'm going to use PowerShell, Windows PowerShell. I recommend you use that as well. And the easiest way to get into PowerShell is to click on the Windows icon or press the Windows button on your keyboard. Just type the word PowerShell and click on Windows PowerShell. Now, I use PowerShell a lot, so I already have a little icon pinned to my taskbar, so I'm just going to click on it, and that's what PowerShell looks like. Now, notice that PowerShell always uses your user's home directory as its starting directory. So mine is C users Michael. So I'm going to be using that. Yours will be different. So when in the instructions I refer to this directory or this path, it is going to be the %home% that represents your user's home directory. All right, so if you do have any existing Vagrant projects, so let's say you go back and try to do this again, you want to remove existing Vagrant projects. So there's instructions in the guide on how to do that, but let's assume that we're starting from brand new. So the first thing I want to do is I want to create a directory to put Vagrant into, or to put all my Vagrant stuff. And so I'm just going to say make dir, mkdir, Vagrant. All right, so I made a directory now called Vagrant, and I'm going to cd down to Vagrant. All right, so there I go. Very, very easy. From here, I'm going to put all my projects in this Vagrant subdirectory. That keeps them from separate from everything else. First thing I'm going to do is create a project called Hyperledger. So I'm going to do a make dir Hyperledger. So now in my Vagrant directory structure, I have one subdirectory called Hyperledger. So let's cd down there. And by the way, I could just type cdh, press the tab key, and Windows is smart enough to realize it'll complete it for me, so I don't actually have to type everything every time. Now, we will be doing a lot of work at the command line in this course. Any good developer has to be able to work both in integrated development environments with GUIs as well as at the command line. Unfortunately, a lot of newer developers shy away from the command line, and that's a mistake. The command line gives you the ability to do a lot more than just simply click through GUIs. So don't be afraid of it. I'm going to try to step you through every individual piece, but we will be doing a lot at the command line here, as well as once we get into Linux. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to fetch a pre-built Ubuntu image and bring it down to Vagrant. So the first thing I want to do is just type in Vagrant, init, Ubuntu/Xenial 64. Now, where did I find this? If you look back in the links that I gave you, I'm going to go ahead and press enter and let this start working. If you look back at the links that I gave you for Vagrant, there is a page that has a list of all the different boxes that you can actually grab or you can get. They're pre-built images. Alright, and so what happens is you can download and use these and reference them anytime that you need. So what I've done here really is I've created a Vagrant file placed in the current directory. So I'm ready to move to the next piece of the puzzle, which is just typing Vagrant up. So before I do that, let's see what's there. Alright, so now we see that our directory was empty. Now it has one file called Vagrant file. Now that's just a pointer. So the very first time I do this, in fact, let me go ahead and show you what's going to happen in the background here a little bit. I'm going to launch VirtualBox, and notice my VirtualBox manager shows that I already have 2 virtual machines sitting there. And let's go ahead and type Vagrant space up and enter. And what that's going to do is it's going to bring up our Vagrant environment, which means it is going to create all of the pieces behind the scenes for a new virtual machine. So he's going to bring the machine default up with a VirtualBox provider. Notice he said it couldn't be found, so he's attempting to find it and install it. So he basically goes out to the appropriate website, the Vagrant website, and he downloads the proper VirtualBox image. He'll register it for VirtualBox and then bring the environment up. So it takes a little bit of time. In this case, it looks like it's only about 26 seconds left, so we'll watch this as it moves ahead. Alright, and you'll notice on the right hand side we see that we registered, or Vagrant actually registered, this new virtual machine, and it's now called the Hyperledger default machine. So it did have a generic name and it's been renamed. And now he's actually booting it, and you'll notice that the image has gone from powered off to running. So that's what Vagrant does for us. It manages all of these pieces, and if you have a lot of different environments, and as a developer you may want to have different virtual machines, Vagrant will help us do that. And now we're finished. Vagrant is now installed, or actually Vagrant's already installed, but the new virtual image has been installed and is now running. So the next question is, how do we get to it? We know we've got this virtual machine running in the background. We can see this Hyperledger default is running, and if I click on it, you'll notice that the little preview shows a little command prompt. So we don't have a GUI for it, and the only way really to get in is to connect to it from a terminal emulator, and that's where PuTTY comes in. So if you launch PuTTY, you'll see something like this. Now my version of PuTTY has lots of other machines or connections already defined. So what we want to do is make sure that Vagrant is running, which we just ran it, so we have Vagrant up, that's running. And before we configure this guy, the first thing we need to do is we need to get some public and private key sets built so that we can log in to our terminal without having to remember to type in the user ID and password every time. So we're going to go through a little piece of, or a few steps here to make it easy for us. So I'm going to type in Vagrant SSH config. SSH is secure shell config. And what that will do for us, it'll actually create public-private key pairs. So we're going to use these key sets or key pairs in order to log in. Okay, there it goes. So we create some stuff underneath home Vagrant Hyperledger Vagrant machines default VirtualBox private key. So he puts things in places that we can grab and use them. So now we want to tell PuTTY, so I'm going to get out of PuTTY for a second, to use these keys. So we're going to link them together. So we do that through PuTTygen. And it's actually PuTTygen that creates these keys for us. The Vagrant SSH config was actually just setting everything up. So the first thing we want to do once we're in PuTTygen, and this is a part of PuTTY, is we want to load these files or these keys that were just generated so that we can generate new keys. So that's the file that we want to load. So we're going to first off make sure that we change this to all files so we can find these files because they don't have the default extent name. And then we navigate to home, which is going to be C users. For me, it's C users Michael. Then from there, we go down to Vagrant. I'll eventually find it. There we go. Hyperledger. Underneath Hyperledger, we go to the .vagrant machines default VirtualBox private key. And there we go. So that's the file we're looking for. We choose Open. And we successfully imported our foreign key. At this point, we want to choose Save Public Key. Save Private Key. Yes. We don't need a passphrase to select it or to save it. And I want to save this as private key putty. So we're in our right directory. So let's just use the file name private _ key _ putty. Save and choose exit. Now what we've just done is we have created and saved a private key that came from SSH config and imported into PuttyGen. And again, don't worry if all these steps are confusing. You won't be tested on these individual steps, but it's stuff that we have to do to make life a little bit easier. So once we do that, let's launch Putty, and we're ready to define our connection. Now if you look back at the Vagrant screen, notice, let me see if I can highlight this. It's not one. There we go. Notice that we have an address for our virtual machine of 127.0.0.1 on port 2222. That's our SSH address. So that's how we can get to this machine. And we log in with the username of Vagrant, and we're going to authenticate that user with a private key. So that's why we went through this whole idea or whole strategy of creating private key. All right, so let's create a session now. If we go over to the session, it's going to be 127.0.0.1, port number 2222, and we got that from Vagrant. I'm going to call this Hyperledger. In fact, I'll call it Vagrant Hyperledger. And I'm going to choose Save. So now in my list here, I have Vagrant Hyperledger that will connect to 127.0.0.1 on port 2022. All right, so let's take a look now. If we go down to Connection, SSH, because I want to define how we put all these together. So Vagrant doesn't know where, Putty doesn't know where the key is yet, so we're going to point him to the key. So I'm going to go down to SSH, auth, and I'm going to browse down to private key putty. So I go back to home, which is users, Michael, Vagrant, Hyperledger, .vagrant, machines, default, VirtualBox, and there's my private key putty. All right. Then I go to Connection, Data, Auto Login Username, and that's where I put in Vagrant. And that's what I got from Vagrant itself. All right, so now that I've typed this in, I need to be careful to go back to Session and choose Save. So we save everything. Once I've done that, now I can open this session. The first thing I see is a warning, potential security breach. That's because the server's host key does not match. You may or may not get that, but I'm going to say, yeah, I agree, this is good. I know what I'm doing, and this is what I get. All right, so this shows me that I'm now connected to my Vagrant machine. It is Vagrant at Ubuntu Xenial. So this is actually the Linux box that we just downloaded, and it's a virtual machine, and we're now running it through Vagrant. All right. We're now ready to move to section 2. Before we move to section 2, I'm going to make a quick change. I don't really like the default way that this looks. Actually, I shouldn't do that. I should just type exit to get me out. There we go. So now I'm going to go back into Putty. And at this point, I'm going to go down to Vagrant Hyperledger, load it up. And I'm going to change the appearance. First thing I want to change is my font. So I'm going to click on Font, and Courier New is actually, I'm going to go with Arial. Perhaps I won't. We'll stick with Courier New. I'm going to go with something larger. Let's go with 14 points. A little bit easier to see. And now let's go to Colors. And I'm going to say the default foreground, I'm going to make that white. Default background, I'm going to make that blue. All right, let's go click on Session, save this, and open it and see what it looks like today. Okay, that was exactly the opposite of what I intended. Okay. Doesn't look bad, but I'm going to do something a little different. So let's go back to Vagrant Hyperledger, load, colors, foreground. Yeah, let's flip that then. So the foreground is what my characters are going to look like, and the background, which would make sense, is white. That's what I intended. All right, so now let's try that. Here we go. Yeah, I like this a little bit better. So it's a little bit easier to see, a little bit larger for the screen. All right. So now that we're in, that concludes step number 2, and we'll be right back. I'm sorry, this concludes step number 1. We'll be right back with step number 2. All right, now we're back for step number 2. So what we've done is we've installed all the Windows defaults, and we have launched our virtual machine. Now, if you're using an actual Linux machine or a Mac OS machine, you can basically just start right here. You don't have to install all the VirtualBox and Vagrant. You certainly can, but you could just simply go directly to the command prompt and start here. So the very first thing we need to do is we need to start installing all of our dev tools. So I'm following along at step 2.1. So the first thing is we're going to type sudo, which is a super user do, which basically allows us to run commands like the super user. We're going to use apt-get update. Now, what apt-get does, that is a package management tool. So what happens is with Ubuntu, we already have default connections to the Ubuntu servers, and they keep track of the latest versions of many, many different software packages. So the first step we always want to accomplish when we're trying to update anything or install anything is use the update command. That just fetches the latest version lists of everything that we want. So it makes sure that we're looking at the latest versions of software packages. All right. Depending on your internet connection speed, it may take a few minutes. With mine, all right, so we're done. So we've read all the package lists and we've updated them. The next thing is sudo apt-get install. So I'm just going to press the up arrow key and it brings back my last command. So I don't have to type everything over and over again. First thing I'm going to install is a package called make. Make makes it easy for us to automatically do things like compile and link application components. The next thing I want to do is I want to install lib ltdl /dev. These are development libraries. Now when you install or trying to install a bunch of stuff, you'll normally be asked for a confirmation. So I'm going to say, yeah, that's the default. The capital Y is yes, so I'm just going to press enter. And now apt-get is going to download and install all these libraries that will prepare us for development. All right, and we're done. And of course, yours is going to take longer than that. I just paused while we were completing the installation there. And now we're ready to move on to install Docker itself. We're going to install Docker CE, which is the Community Edition. Notice in your lab guide there's a link that shows you more complete instructions, but I've just boiled it down to be something that should be a lot easier to install if you just follow these instructions. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste. Actually, I'm not. All right. So I want to remove anything that's already there. apt-get sudo apt-get remove Docker engine Docker IO All right, let's see if I got all those right. Okay, so there's nothing there, so that's good. So now we know, and by the way, you can do this if you mess up anything. You can always come back and remove these packages and start over. All right, so let's try this. Or you can also just delete the whole Docker image and have Vagrant remove it and start you over again. Sometimes that's even easier if you've totally messed everything up. That's one of the reasons that we like to use things like Vagrant. All right, so I'm going to say apt-get install, and there's several things I want to install here. So instead of putting them on one line, I can press the backslash character, press enter, and Linux knows that I'm actually still working on the same command, even though I'm on a different line. Okay, and those are the packages you want to install, and again, install each one of those. Next, we're going to use curl, which will go out and actually execute a command as if you typed it into a web browser. There we go. Took a minute. And then let's run another update. And then now that we've set everything up and we have all of our keys set up so that we can directly connect to the Docker repository, we should be able to say sudo apt get install docker ce docker ce CLI for the command line interface and container daemon.io. Yes. All right, and that's finished. Now we're ready to install Docker Compose. That's 2.1.3. Now earlier I did use the old Control V to paste. I wanted to type in a few commands, but you still can use the copy and paste. If you go to your document, you copy, and come back over to Linux and just click the right mouse key, notice that it will copy right in. So you can paste, I should say, you can paste it right in. So that keeps you from typing a lot. I wanted to at least let you know that I have typed all this in. I'm not just copying and pasting everything. So step number 1 of 2.1.3 to install Docker Compose, we go right in. Now if you're copying these commands from the PDF file, the quote characters may not copy properly. So it's very common for you to have to go back in and actually type over with the real quote character. So if you copied this in, you may actually have to use the back arrow key back over and actually physically type in that quote, both the open and close quote. I'm just going to press Control C since I've already done this. We're done. All right, so the next thing we want to do is, now that we've downloaded some stuff, I want to change the access permissions for Docker Compose. So what I'm doing is I'm using the chmod command, which is change mode, adding execute permission to Docker Compose. Really, really fast. And the last piece of the puzzle is to make sure that it all worked. I want to see the version of Docker Compose. All right, so if this works, it shows us that we've got it installed. All right, and I'm going to ask you, of course, to take a snapshot, take a screenshot of this to make sure that you got the right thing. All right, let's continue on just a little bit more. Let's go to step 2.1.4, and I'm going to go fetch the prereqs for Ubuntu. So it's a shell script. So I fetched that. I'm going to change the permissions for that shell script so that I can execute it. So I'm going to add the execute permissions for the user only, for the owner only, and then I'm going to fire it up. We do that by just simply saying dot, which means // means the current directory. I want to execute a shell script called prereqs.ubuntu.sh. And if I got everything right, it should just run. All right, so clearly yours is going to take a little bit longer. I just skipped ahead a bit, but it all worked. So now we have our prereqs. Notice it says please log out and log in before continuing. Okay, so we'll go ahead and do that. So we just type the word exit and we logged out. So how do we log back in? We just fire up PuTTY again. So let's click on PuTTY and really just double click on Vagrant Hyperledger, and there we go. We're right back in. We don't have to type anything in. It's all automatic. That's why we went through the pain of setting it all up. All right, the first thing we want to do is to move ahead into installing the Go language. So let's run a sudo apt get update to make sure we have the very latest in our code repositories. Then we're going to use wget, which is another method that we can use to fetch data from web servers. And we're going to use that to download an archive file that contains the Go language install. we extract this. Notice that the file name is something.tar.gz. Well, gz is for gzip, and tar is for a tape archive. It's an older version of an archive for Linux and Unix systems. So we're going to use the tar command to extract all this. And he knows how to handle gzip files. And he's going to extract all this very much like a zip file. Alright, so if we take a look at where we are, I'm going to type pwd, which shows me my current directory. And ls-al is kind of like the dir command. And notice in my home directory for home vagrant, I now have a go subdirectory. So that's where that's where our go home is going to start off. So the home for go will be there. Alright, so the first thing I need to do is I need to set up a few environment variables. So what I want to do is edit my .profile file. That's the file that contains a lot of startup information for my login. So every time I log in, Linux is going to look into this .profile script and set things for me, such as environment variables. So I need to edit that. I'm going to use the nano editor. It's a very common editor found on Linux machines. And I want to edit the .profile. So I know I'm in the right directory, but just in case I'm not, I'm going to use the tilde, which basically says go to my home and look for .profile. So it makes sure that I'm editing the right file. So the nano editor uses just regular keys, arrow keys up and down, and control keys at the end, as you see. So what I want to do, I want to add 2 lines after the last line in the file. So I want to say now that I want go path is now going to be equal to my home, which is /home/vagrant/go. That's the directory for GoPath. So now I have an environment variable named GoPath. And I also want to export, which I have to do to make sure it's available to external scripts. Path is now equal to the current value of path as well as the current value of GoPath/bin. So what that does is it adds GoPath/bin, which is go, home go/bin is now part of my path. So I can just type commands. I don't have to type in the full command. So I want to save my file, which is really write out the file. So press Control O to write the file. Yes. And then exit, Control X. And now I'm done. Now to make sure that we get the new version, I'm going to type the command source. That means go out and rerun .profile. Okay, and that makes sure that all of our environment variables are properly set, and just to verify it, type go version, and it shows us that we now have version go 1.12.1 for Linux AMD64 installed. Alright, so we're getting there. So this next step, which will be 2.2.1, well actually we're moved on to step 2.2 to install our source code and set up the business network. So the first step there, 2.2.1, is forking and cloning the trade finance logistics repository. This means that we have to go to GitHub and we're going to fetch a copy and clone it into our own ID. We do this back on Windows in my case. So I'm going to navigate to the URL that I provide. It's GitHub Hyperledger Hands-On Trade Finance Logistics. So I go here, and at this point I'm going to need to either sign in with my own user ID, which I'm going to do, or you may need to sign up if you don't have a GitHub account. But go ahead and sign up. It's free. It's easy to do, and you probably will use one at some point. So I'm going to sign in to my GitHub account. Alright, so now that I'm signed in, I'm just going to click on fork. Right there. Boom. Now I've already done this, and so it may actually give me an error message because I have already forked this. This is my fork or my copy of Trade Finance Logistics. Alright, that's it. Once you fork it and you have your ID, you're ready to go back into Linux, and here we go. So the first thing I want to do is I want to change directories to gopath/src. And that changes my directory down to go/src because we know where gopath is now. Then I want to fetch the cloned copy that I just created. And so what I'll do is I'll paste in the URL that I gave you, but instead of your get name, you want to put your actual get name in. So I'm going to use mine, and boom, there we go. So I just cloned my copy of Finance Trade Logistics, or Trade Finance Logistics. Next thing I'm going to do is make a directory for Hyperledger, and I'm going to link it to where github.com is, or it's going to be for github.com/hyperledger. So we see that we now have this new directory. There we go, github.com, and underneath that there will be a Hyperledger directory. After you make the new directory, github.com/hyperledger, make sure you cd down into that directory. So cd down to github.com/hyperledger. Next step is to clone Hyperledger Fabric release 1.1 into the new directory. And we'll be back when this finishes. Oh, there it is. So that's pretty fast. From here, cd down to Fabric. And from here, we're going to make Docker again. And this is the one that's going to take a few minutes. So we'll let it get started, and we'll come back to it once it's finished. Alright, and once that finishes, it should finish with no errors. If you got errors, one of the easiest mistakes to make is to forget step number 8, where you actually cd down to github.com/hyperledger before you clone and then cd to Fabric and make Docker. So if you forgot to do one of those CDs, you might want to back up and try that again. Alright, the next step is to make some additional packages here. So that was just make Docker. And now we want to also make config txgen and cryptogen. So we're on step 12. And once again, make sure there are no errors. If that is the case, then we're ready to use git to clone another repository. This will be to fetch Fabric CA for our certificate authority. Then let's cd down to the new directory, Fabric CA, and once again make Docker. And that will build the Docker image for the Fabric CA. We've already built several Docker images, and this is one more to go. Okay, so assuming that completed with no errors, you're ready to move to the next section, which is to generate the network cryptographic material. This is step 2.2.2. The first thing, we're going to reposition ourselves into the directory gopath source trade finance logistics /network. We're going to be spending a lot of time in this directory, so this is going to be a common directory you'll return to. Alright, we need to make another change here. We'll use nano to edit our profile file again. So we're going to use ~/.profile. And I want to make the very last line, I'm going to change that to a longer path. Now I've already changed it here, but you'll see in your lab guide, it'll give you the exact path that you'll need to change it to. It's all in one line. So basically what we're doing is we're adding all of these additional directories basically for the Docker images, the bin under Docker for the new elements we've just created. All right, once you've done that, you want to save it, Control O and Control X to get out, and then use source to force Linux to reread it. There we go. And once you have everything set up, you're now ready to generate the cryptographic material, which basically creates all the crypto pieces that you're going to need for your network to talk and play nice. And there you go. That's basically it as far as generating cryptographic material. All right, let's move along. There's one more piece of the puzzle before we can actually launch this network, and that is generating the channel artifacts. So all the pieces of the puzzle, the data elements that you'll need to generate. First off, we want to be in our network directory just to make sure we're in this directory properly. There are two ways to do this. Number one is you can run through the 7 or 8 commands, or you can simply use the trade script that's provided by the author. So I'm going to use the trade script here. So I'm going to run trade.sh, which is a shell script, and the command is generate trade channel. So the channel we're going to create is called trade channel. All right, yes, I'm ready to do this. And that's it. So now we're actually ready to move to the last piece of the puzzle. And this kind of shows whether everything works well or not, and that is to bring the network up. We need to make sure we're in the network directory. So I'm going to go do another CD just to make sure. And then finally, we're ready to type trade.sh up. Yes, I want to start with my channel, trade channel. And there we go. The warning is okay. That looked pretty good. All right, if you're to this point, I will come back and add one quick little peek that you can look into some log files to make sure they're up and running, and you're basically it. So at this point, it looks like everything might be running, but let's just double check. So I want to open a new terminal window. So I'm just going to launch PuTTY again and double click on Vagrant Hyperledger. So I'm going to bring this over here. All right. So at this point, if we want to kind of peek in to see what's going on, we can simply type, docker ps-a. So let's type in docker ps-a, and we should see a bunch of Docker images. And there we go. We see a bunch of Hyperledger, Fabric, Orderer. Here's the peer, Certificate Authority, another peer. So we see a lot of elements. Looks like they're running pretty well. But let's take a look at a log of one of these guys. We can type in Docker logs and enter any one of the container IDs. So let's try really any of these, doesn't really matter. Let's pick any peer. Here's the orderer. We'll use the orderer. So I'm just going to copy the first column. All I have to do is highlight it, move down here, right mouse click, and there it goes. And there we go. There is our log file. All right, it shows us that we've got stuff going on here. There's our orderer. It gets lots of configuration information and shows us that last element is info 006 beginning to serve requests. That means that our network is up and running. So the only piece that we need to complete in order to complete this lab is to bring the network down. And that's going to be pretty easy. If trade.sh brought it up, we're going to say trade.sh down. Yes, I'm going to stop my channel, trade channel, and it will stop all of the different pieces of our network. It takes just a minute to get confirmation that everybody is down, but that's it. All right, so go through the lab exercise, go through the lab guide, and provide me the screenshots I asked for in the instructions, and that is the end of this particular lab. I think this is going to be one of the longer labs because we had a lot of pieces to get put in place. So good for you. If you're to this point and you've got a nice network running, that's a great place to be. Enjoy.